Welcome back to the Compassionate Capitalist Show. Today, we are going to dive into talking about podcasting as a marketing and customer engagement strategy, which, my history, and some of y'all have heard this story, it has become a way to really create that metrics of know, like, trust factor and establish credibility. When I started podcasting many years ago, I won't age it completely. I don't have all those episodes still out, but it's been about a decade, right? And it was back then, there was hardly anybody really doing podcasting, and the dynamics of dynamic content for search engine optimization, podcasting became my way of, one, creating dynamic content, but two, because we were oftentimes interviewing the entrepreneurs and the investors that attended our event, our angel investor events or our big equity conferences, it was a way to engage my private audience of investors outside, because we didn't think anybody really listened to our podcast. So we were using it as a way to push out a video audio content to our investors. So if they clicked on the segment on a certain entrepreneur and pulled up their profile, then we knew that they were interested and we could follow up. And it was a way for us to work within the SEC guidelines of not doing direct solicitation, because we had that relationship, but also they're not in the room when the company's presenting. And so here's a way for them to learn about the value proposition of this company. So now so here's how I got back in. So when the Great Recession happened, I sunset my angel group and I slowly phased that out. And then I had this epiphany that I needed to be the one to bring out the book, Inside Secrets to Angel Investing, in response to the Jobs Act, because I assumed that there would just be this flood of people that would be looking for this information, and they would all come running in, get my book, and then they would opt into my portal, and then I would establish a relationship with them, and I would educate them and grow them into being these really wonderful, active angel investors syndicating deals with each other. Well, the reality was, and I came to figure out, it took me a couple of years, actually, I confess, to figure that out, that just like myself, when I left the corporate world, IBM, I've been working with VCs and banks. I'd never heard of the term angel investing, and I was kind of in the space of capital and entrepreneurism. And so most of my target market of executives were also not familiar with angel investing, but I knew the demographics were that business people listen to podcasts because they want business tips and they want business stuff, and while they're on their treadmill, or they're driving in the car, or they're on the train, they would be listening to podcasts. And millennials and younger folks were a big audience for podcasts. And so I said, one of the recommendations for getting exposure to my book was to get on other people's podcasts. But, I had been kind of out of the game for a minute. And so establishing myself as a credible guest, I went, wait a second, I have a podcast. I could reboot my podcast, and I could interview investors and people that run angel funds and venture capital funds and entrepreneurs that are scaling businesses and becoming angel investors, or entrepreneurs that are helping entrepreneurs scale. They're great service providers. So it's all about, my show, the Compassionate Capitalist Show, is about creating wealth by scaling businesses, best practices to scale to an exit and invest in those things. So I did that because I found that 140 characters or a Facebook ad did not express to my target market the value of angel investing when they didn't even know what angel investing was. And so I had to have that longer conversation with them. And the way to get into their ears to do that know, like, trust factor for me was to have that conversation, have them listening to it. And then through the process of them listening to a thing on e-games, or a thing on NFTs, or a podcast on real estate investing, or things like that, I would get them into the conversation about angel investing and an entrepreneur. So that's why I started that, and I transitioned over it. And I know how a challenge it is to get heard in this world of 5 million podcasts globally with over 70 million episodes. That's, but a whole lot of those are not active. When I would go and I'd search my competition to see, I would pull up these things that were 3 years old. And I was like, who's listening to a podcast that's 3 years old, right? Yeah. And and they would still be ranked. And I'm thinking, this just doesn't make any sense. And so figuring out how to cut through that noise and get found has been a challenge of mine. My guest today, Phyllis Nichols, she's the founder of SoundAdvice Strategies, a podcast production companies. She's best known for helping clients create unique audio experience for their listeners, authors, hello, small business owners, and other creatives that use their podcasts to tell stories, inspire audiences, and build real connections. Phyllis and the SoundAdvice team make sure their sound great and handle all the tech and marketing details. And for established businesses, that is really great because getting it to that point, it takes a lot of time. I finally have found some tools, and we're going to talk a little about using AI as part of that today. And that's been a thing that's really helped my production cycle. Your choice of podcast platforms matters. A lot of that stuff, and we may or may not get into, specifics of platforms, but it's really important. And there's trends that are happening in the podcast industry that I think is going to really improve it, that we will get into. But because here's the thing, Phyllis and I were talking just before we got on here, about her, and she'll tell her full story, but it really, there are two different types of podcasts that are out there. They're the ones that are telling stories, and they're limited series, like watching a Netflix thing. They're about a crime that happened, or they're about some specific thing, and they're limited start and finish. And those are usually podcasters that are in that business of telling those kind of stories. And they do that in a lot of the podcast platforms have gone to like exclusive shows or like that. And a lot of that younger crowd that I mentioned, like my daughter, that's the kind of shows that she always listens to, right? She loves those serial types of shows and things like that. So it's become a sort of a natural fallout of audiences and this and that. But the being able to search in a podcast platform to find a podcast and find you is a challenge. And you'll learn more about that today. So what you're going to get out of today is how it should podcasting be something that you add to solve a problem of your connecting with your audience and what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And what does it take to do that? Why it's important to have a professional organization that's got a track record. There's a large gambit, just like people helping out with LinkedIn. There, a lot of people will contact you and say, hey, let me help you with this and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. So and my daughter actually works for a sales consulting firm, listening to their podcast and creating their social media and blog posts from the podcasts that they do. And they have a whole like calendar that they do in their organization, and they still farm out most of their actual podcast activity of the production side, even though they're a full-fledged company paying people to do their digital media and stuff like that. So there are definitely business return on investment reasons for doing that. And so part of the reason why Phyllis is so good is that she started out as a real salesperson and helping entrepreneurs, her clients, figure out messaging, which, for entrepreneurs that are listening, I'm always talking about that. You're messaging to an investor because you have to target angel investors, very similar to how you target a customer. You have to figure out why would they want to buy your equity, and then be able to and make a buying decision on that. Well, that's same thing that you have to do for your customers. And it's a similar thing you need to do before you start your podcast and sort of figuring it out. And so her customers were requesting that. And then over time, they just got really, really good at this. And this has been their primary focus. So, success has breeded success. And that's why she's here on the show today. And, we'll talk about all the other kind of good stuff as we get into it. So thank you, Phyllis. Thank you. Welcome to the Compassionate Capitalist Show. So happy that you're here today. You're the first person that has contacted me about talking about the benefits of podcasting, and really happy to have you on the show to share that insight.
Oh, well, thanks. Thanks for having me here. I listened to your show and I enjoyed it so much. I was kind of like this, like you get it, right? And you really understand. One of the things I loved about your show is, first of all, it's super practical and educational. I learned a lot. I learned when you talk about some of the concepts, like I think I know a little bit, right? But I don't know much. And also you're just really good, I think, at helping people connect the dots, right? Like how do we take this information and then actually do something actionable with it? So yeah, so I'm really glad to be here, and it's really nice to be able to just talk to you about this stuff.
Great. Okay, good. So we talked about the sales piece and how you became in podcasting, but
Yeah.
how did you become so good at sales and advising companies to know how to do their messaging and engage their target market? How did you develop those skills?
Yeah, some of that I think, just kind of came naturally to me. When I was a salesperson, I actually called on, I sold IT products and services. I called on large companies, and um, I don't know. I just kind of learned. I asked a lot of questions. When I first started, I really didn't know. I was I good at selling, but I didn't. I'm not an IT person. I'm not I didn't work in the IT space, so I just asked a lot of questions. I was learning and training, and then as I got going, and I landed a few really nice clients, and I realized that part of the reason that things had gone well, and the reason they were willing to meet with me was just because I really let them. I think they felt really heard, and I let them really just explain to me what their problems were, what they were looking to solve in the course of just asking questions. And I think that's always served me well, right? Just listening and paying attention. People will tell you what they need and how you can help them, if you have that space for a really nice dialogue. And so helping companies, when I got out of corporate, I was helping salespeople, other salespeople, learn how to do this. And we realized in some cases, they were really good at some of those things, but they didn't have great messaging. So sometimes they were, I think trying to do a lot of convincing, or converting and trying to really, I think I don't know. There's a saying out there that's not new to me. I'm sure everybody's heard it, but which is that, everybody loves to buy, but nobody likes to be sold. And I
Right.
think so. I think some of that was happening. So anyway, we just started helping people really figure out better messaging so that clients could find what they were looking for and recognize, the companies that we were talking to as as an expert or a potential valued partner. In most cases, we were working in the B2B space. And yeah, and then one of those clients we were helping with messaging said, we really want to do a podcast. And so we helped them get that up and launched and running. And that client's still with us over 5 years,
There you go.
5 years running. She's doing awesome. And we just we took on a few more podcast clients, and slowly we've really made this our key deliverable. And I really love it. It's a great, well, I'm enthusiastic about it, but it's just such a good medium for so many people. A lot of us, I love talking to people and meeting new people and asking people lots of questions and listening and stuff, but that doesn't come naturally to everybody. And so a lot of subject matter experts, this is such a good medium because they can share really great information and stuff that they're super passionate and knowledgeable about, and in a way that's not maybe a little out of their comfort zone, but not so far. Because we know if we're going to be so far out of our comfort zone, we're just not going to do it. Right.
Right.
So, I think that's one of the powers of podcasting. And I think why I enjoy it so much, and just working with lots of people who are like, oh my gosh, I can do this. Like I can make this work for me and my business. And it's also I can figure out a way to do it that works into my schedule and my life and my business, and still get my message out in a really compelling way.
Yeah. Very good. Very good. Cool. So at the top, I mentioned about the changes, the growth, like when I mean, I laugh now, like when I went back and I think about what we had done with like our podcast and the purpose of it. And, literally one time I did something on, it was on, uh, carbon tax credits, right? Which is, when reducing, they were doing offsets to carbon and
Yeah.
for pollution and the carbon that goes into the air. And I had this expert on, and literally within a day after that podcast, if you searched on carbon tax credits, it was the top. We were
Right.
above Newt Gingrich and his speech on tax credits when they passed it in
Wow.
Congress, right? This is a while
Wow.
back,
That's
right?
awesome.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. But now, because there's so much, and just the way so many more websites, and so it's so much harder to get discovered, particularly when there's just a volume, and there's big changes that have been happening in the podcast industry. And I'd like to get your your insights on that. So, for example, 2019, Spotify made a huge acquisition of a podcast platform to bring on content and exclusive shows. And there's been this, there was a move towards exclusive shows. And some people might remember when Joe Rogan got his big deal because he had all these followers and stuff like that. And that was like people were the influencers are trying to get exclusive shows, and the idea that people would go to that platform just because that person, right? And then, but now they just announced they're laying off 200 people out of that division and stepping away from exclusivity, offering some of those folks the ability to be on other platforms and trying to be, broader, going for quality, not quantity kind of a thing. Apple has always been this leader of podcasts. Because just people, I think, just because of the Apple phones had it already on there, whereas on the Android phones, there's so many different ways to listen to it, right? And so, but you could never search. And in a thing, if I wanted somebody to go into my Apple platform and search for a topic, they wouldn't stay within my platform. It would go out to whoever else was doing that topic on it. And even finding me, I would tell people, well, you got to search on my name. That's really like the only way to find it, because my RSS feed had my name in it, and there was just a limit. So they're creating a search function in there. They also, you make these, you spend time creating this beautiful artwork, and it would never show up in Apple didn't do artwork, show art, episode art, and now they're going to be doing that, right? So they're changing, and so and YouTube, I had heard when I went to a podcast convention pre-COVID, they were like, oh, and YouTube is like the biggest platform for listening to podcasts. I'm like, I don't think it's the biggest platform for that. Maybe just people are on there watching it, and it happens to be a podcast. So there was this whole movement of videograms where it would just be static and it's just audio with an image, as supposedly that's a podcast. I do YouTube because I think it's good to be able to see people laugh and interact and talk to each other as a way to watch a podcast. And then they recently came out with a podcast channel. Right. You had lists in there, but now they have one and you could get your handle. I got @Angel Investing, which I couldn't believe was available. But even then, when you search on Angel Investing, mine is like, there's people that have done one episode 5 years ago that have, just because of who they were a social media person, has 10,000. So it comes up first, even though it's not current content, and I'm doing something every week. Right. And so they're struggling with their own search mechanisms. They do these surveys. How can we be better? And I'm like, you could be a whole lot better, And so with all of those changes, Phyllis, we're talk about why the industry is recognizing they have to do this, because are they seeing that is it just because of competitive reasons, and newer platforms are gaining market share against Apple, so they have to be more competitive. They can't just be the big dinosaur on the street, and is it because, there was complaints because there are all these dead shows that are out there that are getting the same sort of treatment as people that are actively trying to build audiences? What has been driving this? The mud on the walls to being, more focused. What's driving that? What do you think is coming? Where are we improving within the industry?
Yeah, so you brought up some great points, and you're right. So a couple of things to know. And again, we've been doing podcasting for, working with clients and podcasting for 5 years, which sounds like a long time. It is a long time actually in the podcast world, but in other kinds of content, right? It's just a blip. So a couple things to know. A couple things have happened. Number one, so just as recently as 4 or 5 years ago, Apple Podcasts probably, accounted for over 90% of the downloads. Okay. And partly in large part because the Apple it was originally called Apple
iTunes.
Well, yeah, iTunes basically, right? And then it became Apple Podcasts. Anyway, it was automatically on all the iPhones out there, and then iPads and so forth. And so people just it was just a platform that was quickly adopted and used regularly. So, and other platforms certainly came out, years ago, Stitcher and all these, lots of other than app platforms came up to really serve people who were not iPhone users, the Android market, which is actually worldwide significantly larger than iPhones, but not in podcasting. Anyway, so that happened. So, and I was actually think good for podcasting, right? So they just gave listeners a lot more options. If you weren't an iPhone person, you now had a lot of other really great, easy options to be able to do it. So fast forward now to just a year or two ago, it was I believe it's Edison Research does a lot of really great research every year on podcast trends and all kinds of statistics. And I think it was in 2021. It might have been late 2020, but in 2020 or 2021, Spotify actually exceeded Apple Podcasts
Oh,
in the number
really?
of, like listeners and downloads. And now, from a search perspective, YouTube actually is up there as high. So, partly what happened, you were talking about Spotify. What they did, they basically bought the audience, right? They're like, we can't compete with Apple Podcasts, and because we can't automatically get Spotify put on every Android phone or every iPhone, so we're going to do it differently. So they bought a lot of good content. Joe Rogan still has an exclusive there. He's one of the he's actually, I think, the largest worldwide podcast. And so and I think that actually I think they accomplished what they were looking to accomplish, which was to basically come on par with Apple Podcasts, which they did, right? Like right now, depending, I think, on, what month it is, right? Like they're probably, between the two of them, Apple Podcasts and Spotify, still account for probably about over 90% of the downloads of shows. Amazon Music got into it then, right? Like and so what's happened, and I think this is actually really good for listeners and podcast producers and content creators, right? Now, listeners really get to, it's democratized to some extent, and you can be wherever your listeners like, whatever their, app of choice is. For some people, it actually is YouTube. And some people use YouTube for everything. And so they're listening to a podcast that might just have a static image because that's the app they use for listening as well as watching.
Right.
And you're right. So YouTube is responding to that. In fact, it was just about a year ago, I think right around this time a year ago, YouTube started their own podcast, right?
Oh,
So
oh, really? They have
yeah,
like
they
there's
have.
like best practices on YouTube or something.
Yeah, it was to profile some of their big YouTubers who use like both audio and video content. And I
Okay.
think they just wanted to really sort of see like what they could do with it. And I actually have not listened or checked it out lately. I probably need to go back and do that, but I thought that was fascinating, right? That the video, gorilla in the room that manages all this video, like billions of video views every day, now wanted to get into the podcast thing. So that's interesting, but it's also really good. You were talking about being found. And it is a little bit more challenging now, but it's also, there's now a number of ways for people to find you. So for example, when we talk with our clients, some really basic common sense things are, just making sure, like you talked about, your name being part of your RSS feed. We think that's super important. Obviously being really smart about your titles. Not every title is going to be how to make money or something, or how to lose 30 pounds, whatever, those kinds of things that get searched a lot. But right. But in your industry, the kinds of terms and things that people might be looking for, right? Like angel investor tips, or what's happening, angel investor trends, or just different things in your market, right? Those kinds of terms that get searched a lot, are great to be part of your title. And when it makes sense, right? So I just think, it's nice that a lot of things are working. I do think ultimately now we are seeing some consolidation. You were talking about Spotify laying some people off. There's another app called Stitcher, which has been bought by the company that owns Sirius XM. They're actually shutting
Oh,
down. They're going to shut down Stitcher as an app. Sirius XM is now going to come out with their own sort of big app, because now they have Sirius XM has all kinds of paid content creators. And so they're going to get into the game. And ultimately, I think it's really actually good for the industry. I think it's good for people to have options, both from the consumer and listener side, and also on the producer side, right? Most of us, like I'm certainly probably never going to get a contract with Spotify directly or be on Sirius XM, but I can still get, a significant reach with my show if I do some smart things to my targeted audience. Again, most of the clients we work with are people like you. They're business owners. They are, experts in specific fields. And so they're not necessarily trying to reach every consumer in the world, right? They want to talk to their specific market and the people that are looking for the products and services and the expertise that they provide. And I think it still gives you a great way to do it, and a good way to cut through, I think, a lot of the chatter that's out there, right? So that people can find you and listen and consume. We also know one of the trends that's really cool is, 70% of listeners, first of all, the amount of people who listen to shows continues to grow. It continues to go up year after year. And that's Edison Research statistics, not me saying it. So we know more and more people continue to listen to podcasts and use it as a way to consume some of their content. And we also know that means that it gives people the advantage of being able to, again, reach very specific or targeted platforms or targeted audiences with a platform. And then they can kind of show up everywhere. I think that's the advantage to a small independent podcaster like me or you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, so when it comes to using a podcast to grow a business and, engaging that you were just talking about with your target audience, one of the things, the old way, I guess, the old way of creating that know, like, trust factor was, customer loyalty, creating trusted brands in the digital age. You did a blog post, and blogs were like the big thing. You write something that would be found, and then it would be like this knowledge level, and they go, oh, this person, and, you'd write a book on a topic, and they're like, oh, there must be an expert, they might do loyalty programs. And then, but the goal was to always get them to give you their email, so that then you could start another level of trust, not spamming them, right? But, giving them tips and insights and things like that. So they, so get differentiating yourself from the competition. Those became another level above just advertising to be able to sell that. So podcasting, is like the next level up, because it's a longer conversation, and listening is easier than reading. Well, at least for me it is. So
and for a lot of people,
the convenience of that. When I'm driving, I can't read while I'm driving. I almost always listen to podcasts when I'm driving. So how does that work? Because when they're going to a platform and it's not your web page and they're listening to it, you usually will have a link in there, and you might within it have a call to action. Hey, go check out my link, get my book, whatever. There's now this new thing called dynamic insertion that I've just started experimenting with.
Yeah.
So that conversion factor of somebody, I think it's getting them to listen all the way through, or at least a good portion of it, but converting them to actually engage with you. That seems to be, to me, and I would think most of my listeners that might be thinking about having a podcast or even have a podcast are all like, I have no idea how to do that. It's hard enough trying to get people to just give you a 5-star review. You know what I mean? I've had all kinds of numbers, but I think I only have 20 reviews, so like, please go put a review on mine if you're listening to this. But it's like, so
Definitely.
what are your best practices? You talk with your customers, or how do you set that up and measure a conversion from a podcast listener? Because you got your listener numbers, but then there's the ones that actually engage. How do you handle that?
Well, so if you hold on, sorry, I have my cat just jumped up on my desk and is creating havoc. Okay, I got her off the table. Sorry, people. All right, so you're right. So a couple of things that you talk about. I mean, that is definitely one of the things that we help our clients do from the very beginning. So we want people to be super intentional. I'm glad to hear that you're working and checking out dynamic ad insertion. That's one of the things that we think works the best, because what happens, as you are good evidence of this right now, you have a really lovely, a great library of content. A lot of it's evergreen in nature. Definitely some things in your industry have probably changed a little from time to time, but if people find you, just so the listener understands, dynamic ad insertion gives you the ability. So for example, Karen, if you're going to be speaking somewhere and you want to let people know about that, if you can dynamically put that ad or that little break into your show, it doesn't matter what episode somebody's listening to today. It could be the most recent episode, right? Or it could be an episode from 6 months ago. No matter what episode they're listening to, they're hearing a timely promotion, right? So
Right.
that's one thing that people really need to take advantage of from the beginning, but also is having this strategy from the very beginning, right? And how do we take listeners? We call it taking like listeners from the listener to the client, right? And then we actually help our clients create a path for that. But you're right, a lot of it is and it depends on the client and pardon me, their business model. But something really basic like having people, get on your email list. A lot of people offer something special, like specifically to their listeners, that's just available through the podcast in a specific link. And there's a bunch of different ways to do this, but we really recommend finding whatever path and whatever works in your business and in your particular business model. One of the things that we know for sure, listeners, if somebody's listening to your show, first of all, the connection that's built really is happens much more quickly, especially if you come, somebody like you come across really credible, very knowledgeable, very approachable. So there are people who listen to your show, Karen, who you may never ever meet, but they feel like they know you. They feel like they know who you are, and they feel like they know who, and know that about you. So there's a sort of an intimacy or a connection that is built a little more, much more quickly than, if I read 25 of your blog posts or that kind of thing. It's just part of how humans are wired. When we're listening, you can hear tone and energy and all these kinds of things when we're talking.
Yes.
So that's something else to be mindful of. And so what happens, so when people really feel like they have this kind of a connection, they're much more likely, I think it's about 67% more likely to take a next step, especially if we make the next step really simple. Yeah, really simple, really easy, and obviously value driven, right? So not just like, oh, hey, sign up for my email list, right? But like, here's something that you're going to find valuable, or it's building upon maybe you covered a topic, and there's, in any given area of expertise, right? You've got lots of extra things, or you have a checklist or some sort of information that could support what you've talked about. Sometimes it could just be as easy as like, hey, here's some additional resources if you want to dive into this further, that has my book and a couple of other book titles and 3 or 4 of my other episodes. Like, you can get all this information. Packaging content is another way that we talk about doing that all the time too, right? Taking that library of content that you have, and then, creating a page on your website that says, hey, if you're looking to start angel investing, here are the 6 episodes you need to listen to, right? Mm-hmm. They're already packaged for you. You don't even have to search through all of them. They're right here. So that's what we want people to do. We also know McKinsey, the big, their big corporate
research study stuff,
research
right?
And consulting. Yeah. So they've just recently done a whole big thing about kind of the customer journey and creating, I think, relationships and the strength of that, and what they're seeing. And this isn't new information, I don't think, but I think it's kind of cool that they're now tracking some of these things. Even the biggest, really big enterprise type companies are really looking to foster more sort of one-on-one or intimate connections. We use the word intimate, but so for example, I'll give you a good example. There's a company that we're talking to that works in sort of the power space, right? Like generating power, like that have hydroelectric dams and stuff like that. Okay. So it's a really specific market. And there's some big players in that industry. And so some of those people just want to be known, right? And so podcasting, I think, is a way for that to happen. Like, we're never going to meet the CEO. Like, I'm never going to meet the CEO of, trying to think of a company, right? But the CEO of Nike or something, like, I'm never going to meet that person. But if they have a podcast and they talk about their business and their philosophy and their values,
Yeah.
I'm right, like, then I'm going to feel like, first of all, I kind of know that person, but I'm definitely going to feel more aligned with the brand. And that's another thing we talked about. You mentioned know, like, and trust, and that's foundational. That hasn't changed. I don't think that's ever going to change. But the next step really is then, like, how do we align with that person, right? So consumers these days, even especially B2C, especially in the consumer world, but even business to business, you care about who they're doing business with in many cases. So they want to align with companies that have shared values, that, maybe look at the business world in the same way, or look at their business sector in a similar way. And so one of the easiest ways to do that is to have some leadership people from your company come on a podcast and talk about it, right? In a really approachable, easy way, right? So anyway, we've just seen that really work and be powerful, because again, we don't have access to those people. Like, I would love to call the CEO of Spotify and ask him 100 questions about podcasting and the future and trends, right? But I don't have access to that person. But that person could do a podcast and talk about some of those things. And as a listener and a consumer, I can certainly benefit from that. And I may be much more likely to connect with that company versus another company that's not doing that kind of activity.
Sure. Yep, absolutely. And there was a point that you made that I was gonna oh, I forgot it now. But anyway, it'll come back to me, and I'll come back and follow up on it.
Yeah,
So
please do.
yeah, well, there's a trend as well for, I noticed, like, oh, I think it was the dynamic insertion piece, because
Yes.
that was one of the main things that when I was moving off my old platform, which did not have it, and I took probably I should have done it years beforehand, but I was just like, oh, this is what I know, this is my process, and I was missing out on the ability, and I ended up, it was like I was always having to modify, and my older shows had old intros to them, had web links or websites that weren't even around anymore, and the thing was,
Yeah.
go back and manually change those, or this dynamic insertion. And for those folks that aren't familiar with that, it's basically, depending on which platform, the one I use has one you record, and then you can put it somewhere, anywhere in your sequence of opening, and things like this, and you could put it in different places if you don't want it. And then once you get big enough, if you want to be able to have paid advertising, you can be within these sort of marketplaces that you can insert certain in either in a certain section at a certain time spot, or whatever you kind of do. So that's kind of how
Right.
dynamic insertion works. But so I've seen a kind of a growing thing, and in my particular case, I don't, because of this not knowing who's really listening, but I've seen where there's people are offering private podcasts that you like subscribe separately to purchase, kind of like a membership. And so is that is that because they're kind of a celebrity and they can garner that kind of connection of private, or is it where it's just a bundled part of like a membership organization or a training program? Because I was thinking, why would it does it make it where it's more evergreen for that audience than just doing a Zoom link that you would put into Kajabi, for example, or put a podcast, put a video there that people log into? Is it the convenience factor? Why is there this growing trend towards private, certain listeners get access to a podcast?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it really depends on your strategy. So we have a client that does this. For example, she has a ton of content. I think she's over 300 episodes now on her podcast, a ton of really great content that's out there for free, obviously. She also now does some private podcast episodes that are just part of her membership, right? So she puts together maybe some additional specific content and information that she knows really would apply to her members, and she puts that behind a paywall. There are other people, for example, one other example that popped in my mind right away, there's a and I can't think of their name, it'll pop up it'll come to me, but that they do meditation podcasts, which are super popular. But and they take a different approach. So they make those live, let's say for 30 days. And then after 30 days, they go behind a paywall, sort of like a Patreon. I don't think that's exactly the app they're using, but it's that kind of concept where they're like, hey, if you like our free stuff, you can pay, whatever, $9 a month or something, and then you can have access to this entire library of information if you want. So that's another way to do it. And I also think what we're seeing too, in some cases, especially with large companies, they're doing internal or private podcasts that are meant just for their employees or associates,
Oh,
maybe
sure.
just for their management team. And again, when we talk about this, the ability to connect alignment, right? So if you're the CEO or the COO of a large company, oh my gosh, it's a kitten, and she just, oh goodness gracious. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm just gonna
That's all
ignore it.
right. Everybody that's
Crazy.
watching just had a little kick. It's all you cat lovers out
Sorry,
there.
we have this little kitten who will not go
And
away. Okay,
of a lot. We're the what is it called? Pre-recorded live.
that's right. That's right.
I'm like Jimmy Fallon. I'm pre-recorded live.
That's right. I love it. Oh my God, look, I'm sorry. Oh God, I lost my train of. Oh no, we were talking about the connected. So again, large companies, we're talking to some of them. Again, if you're an employee or a new associate of a company, like how nice would it be to get to listen to like maybe a message from the CEO or the COO or whoever's in charge of your
Right,
division,
sure.
where you really feel like you know who this person is. They're telling you some information about the company that, isn't just a corporate speak, like whatever, right? It's just sort of a real person talking to you. We feel like that's, I think, the power sometimes of some of these private podcasts, right? So they're taking that next step of sort of alignment and intimacy. And again, we're using that word, meaning we're just letting you have a little more access to this person, a little bit. So, and when you have, again, people like, influencers, do this a lot too, right? They have a lot of content that's out there for free, but hey, if you'd like to do a Q&A session with me, for example, like once a month on Zoom or whatever, and we'll record it, all that kind of stuff, we make that private, and that's then behind a paywall. It gives you a higher level of access, some additional information and content, and then a way for obviously the in this case, the creator maybe to either monetize it, or in some cases, maybe it's just, it doesn't always have to be monetized. It could just be like, hey, if you would sign up for this email list, you can get access to these additional, private episodes, or an episode where you can actually submit a question and I'll do an answer in a podcast episode. We have a client that does that, and it works really well. She does Q&A episodes, and those answers are, some of them she shares publicly, but almost all of those are behind like a Patreon type wall. Okay. Hopefully that's the end of that. I'm so sorry.
No, it's fine. Totally.
They weren't
fine
even in here. They were downstairs when we started talking. So
they heard you
she
talking.
wasn't even up here. So yeah, I guess my talking got them up here going, what's she doing? Anyway, I'm so sorry.
No problem. I think it's all fine.
Good.
So how is so we at the top of the hour, we talked about, we talk about the sort of the elephant in the room these days, AI, right? Is it the savior that's going to make life so much productive, or is it the devil that's going to just do the undoing of actual accuracy and, truth in reporting and whatever, right? So the way I have found really useful for me in my podcast adventure, because I create show notes, right, that I can go through as part of this, but then creating something that is really compelling for somebody to read as a blog post that has my link to it and actually has, so I've started taking my show notes and I put it into Chat GPT, because I made the mistake. I thought they could listen to my podcast and give me a summary and 4 takeaways, but no, they don't actually. There's another tool that listens to stuff or transcribes it, and then you can put your transcription in there.
Right.
I just do my show notes, and
right.
Because the first time I did that, I put a link. I said, and they came back with this information, and I was like, Well, that was really good, man. That sounds really good. Wow, they got that of it. I don't remember talking about that. It was like a virtual assistant on there, and it was talking about profitability and how to make a profitable company. I was like, I don't remember her talking about that. And so I asked, I'm like, well, where'd you get that information? And they got it off the internet. So it wasn't even like, so that's what I figured out. Show notes. It's my
Right.
voice, my
Right.
content, my
Yep.
stuff, right? And then it's still not perfect. So I modify it to be like, I'll get, do two versions, and then I'll look for the best of what I remember, because as I'm listening to it, I'm also, looking for excerpts and stuff like that when I re-listen to it. So I think so that's how I use it. How how is it affecting podcasts and podcasters? And what do you think it means for current and future podcasters? Are they using it like I use it, or is there other ways to use the various AI applications to enhance the message, the experience, or the process?
Yeah. So, I mean, I love what you just shared. I think that's smart, right? Where you're taking your information that you've created, right? And just use the resource to be able to summarize it in a way that reads really, really well. I think that's smart. There's also AI has been available for transcriptions for a long time, for probably, I don't know,
Yes.
4 or 5 years, right? So, and they're not perfect, but they might be better. A lot of people do put transcriptions, even if they're not perfect, on their website, just because it's also helpful with SEO, and especially if they use a lot of, keyword rich conversations, that kind of stuff. I'm not an SEO expert, but we know that that actually does help. So, and so I think those practices are good. There are some tools out there that will take a recorded file, like, like what we're going to have at the end of this, right? And they will summarize it, and they'll do some, I think, a post, or they'll do a couple of different things for you. Might pull out a couple of quotes or something. I think those can be good. I think it's like anything else, like the quality of the content that goes in, and I think it is still going to take a human being to sift through that and get like, oh, hey, is that right? Is it worded correctly? This is really what we said? Those kinds of things. I think they'll get better as they go. But I also think, I just got an email the other day. Google's doing some kind of webinar in a couple of weeks, talking about they're already looking at ways to filter AI content, right? To actually not give it the same relevance that they give what they would consider user generated content. Like again, part of that's like a written blog post that you or I might write versus something that's generated by AI. I don't know how good they're going to be at that. I don't know. I know that there's an effort though, right, to be able to, value, again, user generated content that's high value and targeted and all those good things and relevant, versus from something that Chat GPT just kind of spit out over and over, right? We've always So I think that's going to be interesting to see what happens with that. And I also actually think too, it's going to be helpful in some cases for audio content, because I'm a real person, you're a real person, listeners can see that, they know that, especially with my little cat incident. But I think, I think it's when we come back to, again, that know, like, and trust. Like, I want to know that there's a real human being that's actually explaining this, that's knowledgeable, that's coming from a place of competence and excellence and all those kinds of things. So I think I think AI is going to disrupt the content world in a lot of ways. I think in some ways that might even enhance it a little bit. I think there's going to be a great place for people to really that want to show up real. We know that listeners and listeners and consumers, really, of both video and audio content, they for the most part, right, want that to be real people having real conversations and not like a chat bot kind of thing. There's a place for, I think, some of that too, and like support and some other things that are using those kind of bots. But I do think the access to you, Karen, as an expert, I think that value is only going to continue to grow, and I think audio and video content are going to continue to reward that and kind of value that higher, and consider that more relevant content moving forward.
Oh yeah. So have you heard, are people actually using a bot and content, like, say I want to do a podcast on the best, let's say, fantasy football tactics, right? And I'm not the real expert, so I'm going to create something and have artificial intelligence actually say it. Are people looking at doing that level of that just seems really crazy to me, like for all
It
the
does,
reasons you
doesn't
just
it?
said, because it's not a real person with real,
Right.
relatability.
Right. So far, I haven't seen that yet, although I'm sure it's happening. I think it's a two-step process, right? So you got something like Chat GPT that's writing the content. And then there are apps out there where it'll technically read, right? It's going to read that content in a voice that you could use then as audio content. I haven't seen a show like that yet, but I do know of people that are using it, for example, and this is one of the ways that might be a smart way to use it. I have a client that is an author like you, and she gets some book reviews on Amazon occasionally, or a few every month. And so she has one of the bots that read it. She has it read her reviews, and then she might insert that or share that in a YouTube video or in part of her podcast.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah. So it's still authentic in that it's her stuff. So
It's her
yeah.
stuff. It's a real review written by a real person, as far
Right.
as we know,
Sure.
but I'm
Yeah.
assuming
Yeah.
it's a
Yeah.
real person, right?
Yeah.
Amazon tracks that pretty well. Like,
Right.
yeah,
Right.
this person actually bought this book, so you can leave a review.
Verified buyer.
Um, yeah, exactly. Right. And so, so I think that's kind of a clever way to do it. So instead of her reading the review herself to her listeners, or somebody watching a video, like it's coming out from this other voice, which is AI generated. I think some things like that might be kind of cool and helpful. Um, yeah, I don't know. So we'll see.
Sure.
I
Yeah.
think we know for sure it's going to impact content. And I just think as creators, we can be really smart about how we use it. But I definitely think it's never going to be more important to be sort of this real person who's showing up, sharing your expertise in a really high quality way. And I think you'll be rewarded. I think people who do that will continue to be rewarded, both by the search engines and so forth, and certainly by the listener community for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. All right, Phyllis, as we wrap up, what have we not talked about that you hope that we would talk about, and tell people how to get connected, and if you've got resources that you want to make available to folks?
Oh, thank you so much. We've talked about a lot of really good stuff. I think the only thing that I would maybe mention is if somebody out there's thinking about podcasting, and they're just not sure, I would really recommend you to. A lot of people feel like there's already a lot of shows out there, and that they might not be able to make an impact, or they might not be able to reach anybody. And I want to encourage them that I just don't think that's true. We have many clients who have what I would consider modest download numbers. And but because they're really talking very specifically to their target audience, and they're serving them up good content that really matters and is really helpful to them, it brings in new business on a regular basis. And that's really possible. I think. And I think it's much easier. You don't have to be getting hundreds of thousands of downloads a month for that to happen. In fact, a lot fewer than that can actually move the needle. So I think it's important for people to know that. We do have a resource that kind of explains exactly how we do this. And it's, if you go to soundadvicestrategies.com/resource, it's 3 audios that you can just listen to in less than 30 minutes. It just kind of explains kind of that process, how we go from listener to client, and how we can help people do that. So I think that's kind of helpful. And especially if you're doing some due diligence or you're researching some of this, it might be helpful for them.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that. And thank you for being a
Yeah,
guest on
thank you.
Compassionate Capitalist Show. And looking forward to staying in touch with you. And, as we continue to navigate this world of podcasts and customer engagement. So thank you
Likewise,
so much.
Karen, I appreciate you being on here. Plus, it's just super nice to meet you in person. I've listened to so many of your shows, and it's just really nice now that I have like this beautiful face to put with that voice that I've listened to many times. So that's always nice.
Wow. Yeah. I'm going to have to tell this story. Earlier on, you were talking about how people feel like they know you like that, like what you just described. I remember one time, this is back in the precursor of Spec Talk Radio was what the podcast was called back then. And was at this conference, a large capital conference, and I sit down at this table. And my strategy when I'm networking at these things is try to find a table that's not completely full or has, kind of a thing. So I'm not
Yeah.
sitting with the same people. And this guy comes and sits down. He's a couple of seats away from me around, the round tables. And he looks at my badge and he goes, Karen Rands, I listen to your podcast. He was like out of Florida. I was like, it was the first time that had ever happened to me. And I was just blown away. I was blown away
Yeah.
that this person recognized my name, listened to my podcast, and I met him at this conference. And it was, it's still like that was, many, many years ago, but it still just like gave me the goosies and just, like,
Yeah.
oh, there's a real live person out there. So
Yeah.
that's
It makes
that.
an impact. It really does.
So thank you so much for being a listener. Thank you for being a guest on the
Yeah.
show. And to the audience, if you send this out to other people that might be thinking about doing podcasts, other people, your business partner, other folks that you might be trying to convince to do a podcast, or all of the above, right? And let's get the information out there to the people that need it. Thank you so much, and everybody, onwards and upwards. Have a great day.